Hey everybody, I'm Eric, and this is Jonah, the salty prophet. It has a double meaning to it because Jonah was not only thrown into a salty sea, but he was quite salty himself. Some historical and critical background of Jonah is that it's a little tough to put this together historically, but we see Jonah in 2 Kings chapter 14 verse 25. Jonah is talking to King Jeroboam II. So this would place Jonah in the lifespan of at least 786 to 746 BCE. So he possibly could have lived around the same time as the prophets Isaiah, Amos, and or Hosea, depending on the dates of his birth and death. But in that passage of 2 Kings, Jonah is prophesying the boundaries of Israel expanding in the northern kingdom. And this did come to pass. In Jeroboam II's reign, it was a time of stability and a time of affluence for Israel. But it was also a time of injustice, as the book before we saw Amos speaking out against. But foreign rulers and threats to Israel and Judah play a major theme in all of the prophetic books. Israel had faced Babylon and the Persians and then later the Greeks. So understanding this helps us to better understand Jonah's feelings towards the Ninevites. The city of Nineveh was a capital city of Assyria in 700 BCE, and the Assyrians conquered the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE. But things were actually going kind of poorly for the Ninevites in the 8th century, according to Douglas Stewart. And we see Nineveh in the book of Nahum. Nahum's prophecy goes against Nineveh and their violence in Nahum chapter 3, verse 1. So we can see Jonah's bitterness because of the violence that's being played out. But the book of Jonah itself is believed to have been written later than Jonah himself in the 4th century BCE. It's actually mentioned in Tobit and Sirach in the 2nd century BCE. But Bartholomew and Thomas, the book we read for class, it states that this does not actually discredit the historicity of the book. It could simply have just been recounted at a later time for a different audience and a different Israel. But some of the scholars have tried to argue that parts of Jonah chapter 2 are later additions. Bartholomew and Thomas argue that there's no actual textual evidence for those claims. And they further argue the historicity does not dictate the theological truth of the book of Jonah. And you think of Jesus's parables, they're not historically accurate, but they are theologically true. Bartholomew and Thomas wrote literature can be true without being historical. It's powerful. It speaks no matter if the events really happened or not. But as a history lover, I struggle with this. As a theologian, this really speaks to me. But as a history lover, I struggle with this. And I do think this is a historical book, as it seems that Bartholomew and Thomas believe as well. The structure of Jonah, unlike the other prophetic books, Jonah is a narrative. It's telling a story. And it's also unique in that Jonah is talking to a repentant community, but Jonah himself is actually the stubborn one. Another unique theme in Jonah is that it's actually kind of satirical. There's a lot of satirical elements in the narrative. James D. Nogalski, he calls it one of the more humorous books in the Bible, and I actually very much agree with this. Jonah claims to serve God, then he flees on a boat, goes in completely opposite direction if you had noticed the picture from the previous slide. And the pagan sailors are actually the ones that obey God. They throw Jonah overboard, and Jonah does everything in his power to actually not follow God's commands, even though he is a faithful servant in his own eyes. Jonah goes through some satirical irony that can make us chuckle at some points, and he is very melodramatic, and God uses all of that to make some very valid points. We also get some poetic psalm with the narrative. Jonah gives very eloquent prayers of lament and thanksgiving throughout the book, and they are very beautiful prayers. To break down the structure, it can be broken down very simply. Jonah chapters 1 and 2 are rebellion, and Jonah's 3 and 4 are obedience. And most of the scholars that I read agree with that, but they did point out you can break it down farther, much farther actually, as you can see. But the best way to break it down is just the rebellion and the obedience. And Jonah does rebel. He's swallowed by the fish. He's put up on land. He does finally obey, but he does so reluctantly, and God has to chastise him for that in the end. But the theology of Jonah is where I really want to give the meat and potatoes of this, because I think the theology of Jonah is amazing, and it's why it's one of my favorite books in the prophets. The main theology is Yahweh's compassion, not just to Judah and Israel, but to all nations. Yahweh loves people of all nations and wants all to know him. Yahweh reached the pagans on the boat through Jonah's disobedience. Yahweh reached Nineveh, even though Jonah literally went in the opposite direction and did not give a strong message to them. It was a doom and gloom message, but Yahweh still reached them through his compassion. Another theological mainstay throughout the book is prayer. Jonah prayed in all circumstances. Even when he was angry at God, Jonah prayed. The psalm prayers, they're typical Jewish prayers, and it's evidence that Jonah was a faithful Jewish man who prayed for deliverance, who prayed for thanksgiving in dire circumstances. Was he always the most faithful? No. Was he always the most chipper guy? No. But he was a faithful Jewish man who loved God. And then the last point is Bartholomew and Thomas. They suggest that Nineveh not knowing their left from the right means the people of Nineveh did not know the light of God, and they lived in darkness. Jonah was concerned about death, the death of the plant that had been serving him. God was concerned about the entirety of creation, even the animals of Nineveh. No response is given from Jonah. The story ends very open-ended. Jonah's kind of left in a little bit of a darkness there. So this is for Israel to make the connection that they are Jonah. How will they respond? How will they move forward? Will they move forward in light, or will they move forward in darkness? Church's early readings of Jonah, Salvi and the Presbyter, should I not spare Nineveh, the great city, in which there are more than 120,000 persons who know not their left hand from their right hand? He thereby declared that because of the purity of the innocent ones, he was also sparing the faults of the guilty ones. So Salvi and the Presbyter believed the cries of the innocent in Nineveh is what saved those who were guilty, because God is merciful and wanted to save those who were innocent. Ambrose said, "Brothers, a book has been read in which it is prophesied that sinners shall return to repentance." I added that just a man had been willing to receive even blame, so as not to see or prophesy destruction for the city. This is in response to Jonah's anger at the vine and Nineveh's salvation. And we'll go over that actually a little later, as that's the passage I chose. And also, to go with the night and dark theme and the light, St. John of the Cross said that God's light shines in dark nights so that we may see. The New Testament references of Jonah. So Jesus proclaimed that the generation will see no more signs than the times of Jonah. He said this in Matthew 12, 38 to 42, and Luke 29 to 32. He's saying this because Jonah had spent 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a fish, not a whale, it was a fish, and the Son of Man will spend 3 days and 3 nights in the grave. So Nineveh had repented, but someone far greater than Jonah has arrived, which is Jesus himself. And the people, they had wanted a sign, and Jesus is telling them, hey, it's right here. I'm your sign. I am enough. And Jesus also echoes Jonah chapter 4, verse 11, when he gives the Great Commission. As the Father has sent me, so I send you. The reason I picked Jonah chapter 4, verses 9 through 11 is because we always talk about the giant fish and Jonah going into Nineveh and preaching, but I love this part. There's a lot of theology in there. Jonah chapter 4, verses 1 through 8 is called Jonah's anger in the NRSV. I think it could be called Jonah's hissy fit, because he's mad that Nineveh had repented and they were spared. And Jonah's asked this rhetorical question, but it doesn't matter, it's rhetorical. He gives an answer anyways. And he's asked if this plant that had been sheltering him was enough to be angry over. And he says, yeah, I'm angry enough that I could die. And God is trying to give Jonah time to reflect on his selfishness. But Jonah's having none of that. He's just throwing his little hissy fit. So God tells Jonah he had no involvement in the creation of that plant. Yet he wants it because it's serving him. And here's Jonah. He's mad about Nineveh being spared when God had created those citizens of Nineveh. Sadly, Jonah's happiest response in the entire book is over this little plant. So God's asking why. Why would I not show pity to Nineveh, my own creation? Why are you, Jonah, so self-centered? And to top this off, it contrasts with the fact that God was sheltering Jonah. Even though Jonah's being a jerk, he's being selfish, God had been sheltering him. So why should God not take pity on Nineveh when he had taken pity on Jonah, who's being a jerk? The theology of this is that we are not called to distribute God's justice. We are called to share the message of God's grace, according to James D. Nagalski. When giving his prophecy, Jonah only proclaimed doom and gloom because he wants Nineveh's destruction. He wants the Assyrians to get what's coming to them. But God's message still reached the Ninevites in spite of Jonah and his doom and gloom message. And while I did not find any New Testament references to this passage in my research, I couldn't help but make a connection with Jonah and the faithful brother in the parable of the prodigal son. The brother who stayed with the father was so upset that the father not only welcomed the prodigal son back into the home, but also celebrated his return with a fatted calf. Jonah, likewise, is upset that Nineveh repented and is spared, and how could they be spared when they had been this bloodthirsty nation? So I see a big connection there with that brother and Jonah's actions. I want to thank you all for listening. Believe it or not, this was my shortest take. I'm sorry I still went over my 10 minutes, but I thank you for all for listening and have a blessed day.